There's a question that stopped me cold when I was researching German food history. What did people do before refrigerators existed, and how did they manage to eat well through brutal winters when nothing was growing? The answer turned out to be one of the most fascinating rabbit holes I've ever gone down. Germans didn't just survive without refrigerators. They built entire food cultures around preservation techniques so effective that some of them are still used today, not out of necessity, but because the results taste better than anything a modern appliance can produce. Let's get into it. First on the list is einkochen, which translates roughly to cooking down or canning. This is one of the most beloved preservation methods in German households, and if you visit a German grandmother's kitchen, chances are you will find rows of glass jars lined up in a cool cellar filled with preserved fruits, vegetables, and even meats. The process involves placing food into sealed glass jars and then submerging those jars in hot water for an extended period. The heat kills bacteria and creates a vacuum seal as the jars cool down. What makes einkochen special is that it locks in flavor incredibly well. Strawberry jam made through einkochen in the summer can taste just as vibrant and fresh when you open it in the middle of January. Germans have been doing this for generations, and the equipment used, like the iconic Weck jars with their rubber rings and glass lids, has barely changed in over 100 years. The Weck company itself was founded in Germany in the late 19th century, and their jars remain a household staple across the country. There's something almost ritualistic about einkochen season in Germany. Families gather, fruits are sorted, jars are sterilized, and the whole kitchen smells like something beautiful is happening. Beyond fruit preserves, Germans also use this method for tomato sauces, soups, and even whole meat portions that can last for well over a year when sealed properly. Next up is Einlegen, the art of pickling, and this one is deeply embedded in German culinary identity. The word itself means to lay in or to place into, and that is essentially what you're doing, placing your food into a preserving liquid, usually vinegar or brine. Germany is famous for its pickled vegetables, and the variety is staggering. You have pickled cucumbers called Gewürzgurken, which are those tangy, spiced pickles that accompany so many German dishes. You have pickled red cabbage, known as Rotkohl, pickled beets, pickled pumpkin, and even pickled eggs in some regions. The acidity in the vinegar creates an environment where most harmful bacteria simply cannot survive, which is why pickled foods can last for months without any refrigeration. What makes German Einlegen particularly interesting is the spice combinations used. Mustard seeds, bay leaves, juniper berries, dill, and peppercorns are common additions that not only help with preservation but also create those complex, layered flavors that make German pickles so distinctive. In older German households, large clay pots called Steengutapfe were used for pickling, and some families still use these traditional vessels today. The process is simple enough that even beginners can do it at home, but the results can be extraordinary, transforming ordinary vegetables into something that has depth, tang, and real character. Now let us talk about sauerkraut, because no discussion of German food preservation would be complete without it. Sauerkraut literally means sour cabbage, and it is arguably the most iconic German preserved food in the entire world. The process behind sauerkraut is called lacto-fermentation, and it is one of the oldest and most reliable preservation methods humanity has ever discovered. Here's how it works. You take fresh cabbage, shred it finely, and then massage it with salt. The salt draws out the natural water content from the cabbage through a process called osmosis. This liquid, combined with naturally occurring bacteria on the surface of the cabbage, creates a fermentation environment. Over the course of days and weeks, beneficial bacteria called lactobacillus convert the natural sugars in the cabbage into lactic acid. That lactic acid is what gives sauerkraut its characteristic sour flavor, and more importantly, it is what preserves the cabbage by lowering the pH to a level where harmful bacteria cannot grow. What is remarkable about sauerkraut is that this process requires nothing more than cabbage, salt, thyme, and a vessel to ferment in. No heat, no vinegar, no special equipment. The food essentially preserves itself. In traditional German homes, large wooden barrels or ceramic crocks were filled with sauerkraut in the autumn to provide food throughout the long winter months. Beyond just being a preservation method, sauerkraut is also extraordinarily nutritious. The fermentation process produces beneficial probiotics and actually increases certain vitamin content, particularly vitamin C, which is why German sailors used to bring sauerkraut on long voyages to prevent scurvy. Some German families still make their own sauerkraut at home today, maintaining a tradition that stretches back well over 1,000 years. Moving on, let us explore Rauchern, which is the German tradition of smoking food. Smoking is a preservation technique that works on multiple levels simultaneously, and the Germans have elevated it to a genuine art form. When you expose food to smoke from burning wood, several things happen at once. The smoke contains antimicrobial compounds that coat the surface of the food and inhibit bacterial growth. The heat from the smoking process reduces moisture content, making the environment less hospitable for bacteria and mold. And certain phenolic compounds in wood smoke act as antioxidants, slowing down the process of fat going rancid. German smoked products are world-renowned for good reason. Schwarzwälder Schinken, or Black Forest ham, comes from the Baden-Württemberg region and is traditionally smoked over fir branches and pine cones, which gives it that distinctive flavor that cannot be replicated anywhere else. Westfälischer Schinken, or Westphalian ham, is another celebrated example, cold smoked over a mixture of beechwood and juniper. German smoked sausages, known collectively as Raucherwurst, come in dozens of regional varieties, each with its own particular wood choice and smoking duration. The Schwarzwälder Speck is another smoked specialty that uses specific local wood to create a flavor profile, tied directly to its geographic origin. Smoking was historically performed in dedicated smokehouses called Räucherkammer, and many rural German farms had their own. The combination of the right wood, the right temperature, and the right duration was knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. Cold smoking, where the temperature stays relatively low and the process can last for days, creates very different results compared to hot smoking, which is faster and produces food that is simultaneously cooked and preserved. Both methods are used throughout Germany, depending on the product and the regional tradition. Let us now dig into Trocknen und Dörren, the German practice of drying and dehydrating food. This is one of the most ancient preservation methods in human history, and the principle is beautifully simple. Remove the moisture from food, and you remove the conditions that bacteria, yeast, and mold need to grow. Germany has a long tradition of drying fruits, herbs, mushrooms, and meats. Dried apple rings called Apfelringe were a staple in traditional German households, often strung on cords and hung near a wood stove or in a dry attic space to slowly dehydrate over several weeks. Dried pears, plums, and cherries were also commonly preserved this way, and they could last through the entire winter and beyond. Dorfleisch is the German term for dried meat, essentially what we might call jerky today, and it was an important food source for traveling and for winter survival in earlier centuries. Wild mushrooms, particularly Steinpilze or porcini mushrooms, were, and still are, dried in many German homes after autumn foraging trips. When rehydrated, these dried mushrooms regain most of their texture and flavor and bring an incredible depth to soups and stews. German herb gardens have always been an important part of rural life, and drying herbs like chamomile, mint, thyme, and sage was a seasonal activity that ensured a supply of both culinary and medicinal plants throughout the year. Traditional German drying was often done in warm attic spaces called Trockenboden, where natural airflow and low humidity created ideal conditions. Today, electric food dehydrators are common in German households, but many people still prefer the traditional slow-drying method, saying the results are superior in flavor and texture. Here is something that might surprise you. Salt preservation, or Einsalzen in German, was one of the primary ways Germans kept food for centuries before any of the other methods we have discussed were widely accessible. Salt is a powerful preservative because it draws moisture out of food and out of bacterial cells through osmosis, essentially dehydrating and killing harmful microorganisms. The preservation of meat, fish, and certain vegetables with salt has been practiced in German-speaking regions for thousands of years. Salt cod, salt pork, and salt beef were all common preserved foods in earlier centuries. The process of pokeln, which refers specifically to curing meat with salt, is still practiced today in the production of many traditional German meats. Gepickeltes Fleisch, or salted and cured meat, was a household necessity in pre-industrial Germany, especially in rural areas where keeping animals through winter was difficult. Fish preservation through salting was particularly important in northern German coastal regions, where Bismarckering, the famous pickled herring named after Otto von Bismarck, originated. The legend goes that Bismarck was so fond of this particular preparation of salted and pickled herring that it was named in his honor. Traditional German salting methods often combined salt with other spices and herbs to create specific regional flavor profiles, and the knowledge of exactly how much salt to use and for how long was considered valuable craft knowledge. Salt was historically so valuable as a preservation commodity that entire trade routes were built around it, and several German cities, including Salzburg, literally meaning salt castle, grew wealthy through the salt trade. Now we need to talk about schmaltz, which is the German practice of preserving food in fat. This technique is much older than most people realize and works on a straightforward principle. Fat creates a physical barrier that cuts food off from oxygen and airborne bacteria. When you submerge cooked meat, fish, or even vegetables in solidified fat, you're essentially sealing them away from the outside world. The most well-known German application of this technique is Schweineschmalz, which is rendered pork fat used both as a spread and as a preservation medium. Cooked meats were packed into crocks and covered with a thick layer of pork lard, which would solidify as it cooled and create an airtight seal. Stored in a cool cellar, these preserved meats could last for months. Ganzeschmalz, or rendered goose fat, was used in the same way and was considered a particularly prized ingredient. Duck confit is a French preparation, but the German equivalent using pork or goose has been practiced for centuries. Bratwurst and other sausages were often packed in fat for long-term storage. The fat-preserved products were typically stored in ceramic pots in the Keller, the cool underground cellar that was a standard feature of traditional German homes. What is fascinating about schmaltz preservation is that it doubles as a flavor enhancement. The fat absorbs the flavors of everything it comes into contact with, and when that fat is then used in cooking, it passes all of those accumulated flavors onto the next dish. Nothing was wasted in the traditional German kitchen. Speaking of the Keller, we should talk about how the German cellar itself was an essential preservation tool. The Vorratskeller, or storage cellar, was not just a convenient space. It was a deliberately designed and carefully maintained food preservation environment. Traditional German homes were built with deep root cellars that maintained a consistent cool temperature throughout the year, typically somewhere between 4 and 12 degrees Celsius, which is just above freezing. This temperature range slows bacterial growth dramatically without freezing food, making it ideal for storing root vegetables, cabbages, apples, turnips, and fermented foods. The cellar was divided into different zones for different types of food. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, parsnips, and beets were often stored in wooden crates filled with sand or sawdust, which maintained humidity and prevented them from drying out. Cabbages were sometimes stored whole with their outer leaves intact. Apples and pears needed to be stored separately from most other produce because they release ethylene gas, which speeds up ripening and spoilage in neighboring fruits and vegetables. The Keller also housed the family's supply of preserved jars, cured meats, and fermented crocks. Maintaining the correct temperature and ventilation in the cellar was an important skill, and older German homes were designed with this in mind, often featuring small vents that could be opened and closed to regulate airflow and temperature as the seasons changed. Let us now cover Einmachen, which is closely related to Einkochen, but has its own distinct identity in the German preservation world. While Einkochen focuses primarily on heat processing sealed jars, Einmachen is a broader term that encompasses the entire practice of putting food up for later use, and it includes methods like making jams, jellies, and marmalades, specifically with high sugar content as the preservation agent. Sugar, like salt, draws moisture out of bacterial cells and creates an environment that is inhospitable to microbial growth. German Konfitur, the high-quality jam made with a significant proportion of fruit, is a product of this tradition. Erdbeerkonfitüre. Strawberry jam and Himbeer marmalade, raspberry preserve, are made each summer in enormous quantities in traditional German households. The combination of cooking the fruit to high temperatures, adding a substantial amount of sugar, and then sealing the product in sterile jars creates a product that can last for years. German Geli, clear fruit jelly made from strained fruit juice and sugar, is another product of this tradition. The ratio of sugar to fruit and the correct setting point are critical pieces of knowledge that have been passed down through generations of German home preservers. What strikes me about this practice is the deep seasonal awareness it requires. You cannot make exceptional strawberry jam from mediocre strawberries, so German home preservers are attuned to when each fruit reaches its peak and they move quickly when the moment arrives. There is another traditional German method that does not get enough attention in the modern world, and that is Quark und Käse preservation, which is the use of fermented dairy products as a preservation strategy. Germany has an extraordinarily rich dairy fermentation tradition. Quark, which is a fresh curd cheese made through bacterial fermentation of milk, is a staple of the German kitchen. The fermentation process that creates quark also makes it significantly more resistant to spoilage than fresh milk. Hard cheeses produced through extended aging and fermentation can last for months or even years at room temperature when properly managed. Traditional German regional cheeses like Harzer Käse, the strong-smelling aged sour milk cheese from the Harz Mountain region, and Allgauer Bergkäse from the Allgäu Alps region, are products of this long dairy fermentation tradition. The controlled introduction of specific bacterial cultures, combined with careful management of temperature and humidity during aging, allows these cheeses to develop complex flavors while remaining safe to eat over extended periods. Buttermilk and sour milk, fermented sour milk, were also common preserved dairy products in traditional German households, providing nutrition during seasons when fresh milk might not be available. One more technique worth highlighting is the German tradition of alcohol-based preservation. Rumpot, sometimes spelled Rumtopf, is perhaps the most famous example, and it is a genuinely beautiful tradition. A Rumtopf is a large ceramic pot into which Germans layer fresh summer fruits. use it with sugar, and cover everything with rum or another strong spirit. As the summer progresses, new fruits are added as they come into season, each layer covered with more sugar and alcohol. By the time winter arrives, the pot is sealed and the fruits have been preserved by the combination of sugar concentration and alcohol content, which together prevent bacterial and yeast activity. The resulting product, a rich, intensely flavored alcoholic fruit mixture, is traditionally served over ice cream or as a dessert accompaniment during the Christmas and winter period. Kirschwasser, the cherry brandy from the Black Forest region, and other German fruit spirits called Obstler are also used in fruit preservation, cooking cherries or other stone fruits with enough alcohol to preserve them safely. Beer or beer was historically important as a safer alternative to water in areas where water quality was unreliable, and the fermentation process that creates beer is itself a preservation technique. The alcohol and acidity in traditionally brewed beer made it considerably more shelf-stable than unfermented water, and German brewing traditions have been refined over centuries. The Kräutergarten, or herb garden, deserves a final mention as a complete preservation ecosystem in itself. Traditional German herb gardens were not decorative features. They were practical preservation resources. Herbs were grown, harvested at their peak, and then dried, infused into oils and vinegars, or prepared as tinctures and extracts. Herb vinegars made by steeping fresh herbs in quality vinegar served double duty, both preserving the herb flavors and creating a flavored preserving liquid that could then be used in pickles and dressings. Herb oils, while requiring careful handling to prevent botulism risk, were used in various preservation applications. The German apothecary tradition of preparing Heilkräuter, or medicinal herbs, through drying and other preservation methods also overlaps significantly with culinary preservation practices. Many of the same herbs that were preserved for cooking were also preserved for household medicine, and the knowledge of how to properly dry and store these plants was considered essential domestic knowledge. 3 final thoughts to close this out. German food preservation is not a relic of the past, but a living tradition that continues to evolve and adapt in modern kitchens around the world. These techniques are not only practical and effective, but are often superior to refrigeration in terms of the flavors they develop and the nutritional value they maintain. And perhaps most importantly, learning even one of these methods connects you to something far larger than a single recipe, a continuous thread of human ingenuity stretching back across thousands of years of careful, clever, and deeply respectful engagement with food.